Welcome, everyone, to today's program. I'm Megan Wood with Becker's Healthcare. The program will begin with a presentation, and we will have a question and answer session following completion of the presentation. You can submit any questions you have throughout the presentation by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Our presenters will attempt to answer as many questions as they can during this time. You will receive an email within about a week following the webinar that will include instructions for how you can download a copy of the presentation. You will also receive a follow-up email shortly after completion of the program. You can submit your feedback or any additional questions at that time. This email will not include the presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. John Bartos is the CEO of CollectRx. Mr. Bartos is a veteran in the field of healthcare services, revenue cycle management, and information technology. As president of Dr. First Incorporated and an executive vice president of Prematics Incorporated, Mr. Bartos is specialized in providing cost containment services to health insurers and various products and services to hospitals, health systems, and other healthcare providers. Previously, Mr. Bartos was an attorney at Kirkpatrick & Lockhart, now K&L Gates, where his practice focused on litigation. Mr. Bartos' clients have included a wide range of for-profit and not-for-profit health insurers, including Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida, Capital Blue Cross, Kaiser Permanente of the Mid-Atlantic region, and Care First. Mr. Bartos has also worked on behalf of numerous hospitals and health systems, including MedStar Health, along with hundreds of physician practices. Mr. Bartos is a graduate of Princeton University and received his JD from the American University Washington College of Law, where he graduated summa cum laude and was a member of Law Review. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Mr. Bartos to begin today's presentation.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Appreciate it. Hello, everyone. I am John Bartos, CEO of CollectRx, and appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to sit in on today's presentation. So basically, I'm going to be talking about what we're seeing on the front lines when it comes to out-of-network and the landscape. And the topics I'll cover include our view of of the future of out-of-network. I'll talk about the payer tactics to reduce payments on your out-of-network bills, some of the complexities that have arisen as a result of those efforts, and how to combat them. I'll also talk about limited benefit policies, talk about the pros and cons of outsourcing, and I'll also touch on third-party rental network agreements and the pros and cons of entering into those agreements as well. And my hope is when you leave here today, you have a sense of the importance of out-of-network from a revenue enhancement perspective. You understand what the insurance companies are doing. Hopefully you have a few helpful hints on what you can deploy to do better on those bills. And then hopefully you'll walk away with an understanding of the pros and cons with respect to outsourcing and third-party rental network agreements. Next slide, please. So before I dive into what's happening on the front lines, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about our expertise, where we come from, so you understand why we're in a position to address these issues. So despite our name, we are not a collections agency, we're not a billing company, we have nothing to do with the pharmaceutical industry. Simply put, what we do here at CollectRx is help providers get higher reimbursements on their out-of-network bills, and we do so not as consultants, but as experts in negotiating higher reimbursement rates on out-of-network bills. You can think of us as your prescription, if you will, for higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. Next slide, please. So we are the only company in the country focused solely on helping providers get higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. We work with more than 1,300 customers nationwide, and we have more than $1 billion in out-of-network bills go through CollectRx each year. We work with a variety of different providers on a variety of different types of issues. So from surgery centers to physician practices to surgical hospitals to health systems, labs, and we work with them on a variety of different issues, including, for instance, spine and the unique issues they face with respect to things like implants and injections as an example. Next slide, please. So a big reason for our success is that over the years, we've built a team of people who have deep expertise in understanding what the payers, the negotiation vendors, the repricing vendors, what they do to limit your out-of-network reimbursements. And That expertise comes from having worked for those organizations and thereby knowing the soft spots to push to get higher reimbursements on out-of-network bills. Another big reason for our success is what we call our CRIXIS Business Intelligence Engine. And CRIXIS stands for CollectRx Information System, and I'll be referring to CRIXIS in a couple different places in the presentation. But basically, it's the internal data and analytics tool that we've developed that helps us as we go toe-to-toe with the payers with respect to out-of-network reimbursements. It does things like allow us to analyze insurance policies from across the country. It provides us with an incredible amount of comparable data because we're aggregating the data and results of the hundreds of customers that we work with. And we use these data and analytics to compare our determination of reasonable and customary with the payers, and that allows us to identify holes in their data and get them to make higher payments. And then the CRIXIS Business Intelligence Engine also allows us to capture business intelligence on the tendencies and trends of the people on the insurance company side. And because we know these organizations so well, we know how to get to the right person, and oftentimes it's about getting to the right person to get a higher reimbursement for our customers. So CRIXIS combines all of that data and suggests best case results. Next slide, please. So one critical overarching point before we dive in, and that is that out-of-network reimbursements are higher and frequently much higher than in-network reimbursements. Now, I'm not saying it happens all the time, not in every geography, not every payer, but generally speaking, out-of-network reimbursements are higher. And the key for providers is to figure out how to maximize that opportunity, because let's face it, as you survey the landscape today, candidly, there aren't many opportunities to improve your reimbursement rates. Your in-network contracts are what they are, and they're very difficult to negotiate higher rates in those contracts. And with respect to your Medicare and Medicaid cases, there's literally no opportunity to improve those reimbursement rates. But out-of-network represents the last great opportunity for a lot of providers to bring more dollars in the door and improve the bottom line. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that as a backdrop, let me start by talking about our view of the future of out-of-network. And I go to a lot of conferences, I read a lot of industry publications. I'm continually amazed at how often people have it half right when it comes to out-of-network, or frankly, not right at all many times. And I'm also amazed that providers don't do more to take advantages of what out-of-network has to offer. Next slide, please. So simply put, our view is that out-of-network will remain an important part of the reimbursement landscape for a number of reasons. One of those reasons is it's a big market. It's a $60 billion plus market, and it's been steady like that for several years. Again, it's a big market for out-of-network compared with the rest of the marketplace. Next slide, please. So an example is, here's a data point that shows that out-of-network opportunity is not diminishing. This is data from one of our long-term clients for whom we do appeals. This shows that the amount of the average additional payments we've obtained for this client on appeals has remained virtually the same for the past 4 years, indicating that the opportunity is the same as it's ever been. Next slide, please. So it's not only the size of the market, it also has to do with PPO growth. That's an important part of the marketplace is PPO enrollment, and most out-of-network bills come from PPO members. Next slide, please. PPO enrollment has more than doubled as HMOs have declined, and statistics show that 10 to 20% of PPO members will have an out-of-network experience each year. Next slide, please. Another reason is the Affordable Care Act and the provisions in the ACA that promote the growth of out-of-network patients. Next slide, please. So there are really two reasons why the ACA is going to cause more out-of-network care. One is that, first of all, you have the number of people, 10 million and growing, who have received insurance through the ACA marketplace. And while certainly not all plans are friendly towards out-of-network care, a portion of those that do sign up now have out-of-network benefits. Since most of the 10 million who are insured now under the ACA marketplace, since most of them were not insured at all prior to that time, any increase in the number of out-of-network patients is an increase overall. Next slide, please. We'll also see an increase in out-of-network as narrow networks accelerate under the ACA. So what is a narrow network? A narrow network is a health insurance plan that places restrictions on providers available to the insureds. While narrow networks were already in place prior to the adoption of the ACA has accelerated their growth. So the narrow networks place these limits on insureds by charging higher patient responsibility for care provided outside the network, but for the most part, they don't prevent patients from seeing those providers. As such, you have fewer providers in the network, which by definition leads to more out-of-network care. And it's important to note that the providers who are being sort of boxed out with respect to narrow networks are not, sort of fringe providers, if you will. You're seeing in the major markets, you're seeing major hospitals, health systems, not able to get into the narrow networks. And in fact, there's litigation about them trying to get in. So by definition, though, you'll have fewer providers that are in network, making it more important for people to be able to understand and deal with out-of-network issues. Next slide, please. So let me talk for a couple minutes about limited benefit policies. And sometimes I hear people argue that the adoption of so-called limited benefit policies means that out-of-network will be negatively impacted going forward. So just so we're on the same page, a limited benefit policy is one that limits out-of-network benefits. Frequently, these policies tie benefits to a percentage of Medicare. It could be 100% of Medicare, it could be 150% of Medicare, or anywhere in between. You may have heard of the United Healthcare MNRP policy or the Cigna MRC2 policy. Those are both examples of these types of policies. But based on what we've seen, we believe the impact of these policies on the out-of-network opportunity has been overstated for the reasons I'll talk about on the next slide. Next slide, please. So let me review those reasons. First, looking at cases in Crixus, the majority of United Healthcare and Cigna cases that we handle at CollectRx are not MNRP or MRC policies. Rather, the majority of bills that we see are standard, reasonable, and customary reimbursements. We also dug back further and looked at our data with respect to MNRP and MRC2 cases. And as the data in the graph above shows, the change, if you will, in the marketplace really occurred in 2012, 2013. And if you look at 2013, 14, and 15, the percentage of those cases that involve those policies has remained virtually identical here. In other words, this would show that the impact has already occurred, again, in 2012, 2013 timeframe. Now it's stabilized and isn't getting worse. And then finally, the last point to make here is that even if the limited benefit policy is being used, there are ways to get substantially higher reimbursements on those bills. Next slide, please. But by far the biggest reason, and in our view sort of dwarfs the reasons I've talked about so far, that out-of-network isn't going anywhere is that people want to have out-of-network benefits. People are willing to pay for out-of-network benefits. And at the end of the day, payers will have no choice but to sell policies with these out-of-network benefits to meet customer demand. And for all those reasons, we see that out-of-network is not going anywhere and is here to stay. Next slide, please. So as we were talking about earlier, out-of-network reimbursements tend to be higher and can be much higher than in-network reimbursements. And the insurance companies know this. They're happy to keep the premiums, mind you, but they use a variety of tactics to attempt to lower out-of-network reimbursements. They prefer providers to be in-network where they can limit reimbursements and control the providers. But as a result of these efforts, issues surrounding out-of-network reimbursements have grown more complicated over the past several years. But if you're good at it and can deal with these complexities, there is a great opportunity for providers to reap the financial benefits of being out of network. Next slide, please. So a bit of history here. Back in the good old days, so to speak, before 1990, out-of-network bills were paid at full bill charges. Next slide, please. But today, payers use a variety of tactics which allow them to reimburse providers at between 20 and 50% of bill charges. But again, if you know what you're doing, you can improve these results considerably. Next slide, please. There are two major strategies used by the payers to minimize your out-of-network reimbursement. One way to think about it is as an economist might. First, you have the micro-level strategy, which is where bills are minimized on a bill-by-bill basis. Then there's the macro-level strategy when bills are subject to different types of global discount agreements. Next slide, please. Before I dig into the individual bill reduction tactics in detail, let me talk about the payer's approach to this strategy. Next slide, please. Now, what the insurance companies do is they outsource the implementation of the bill-by-bill minimization tactics to companies that specialize in helping payers reduce payments to providers, either through negotiation services or repricing services, or both. You may have heard of these companies, folks like Multiplan and Viant and NCN, GCS as examples. Collectively here at CollectRx, we refer to these companies as vendors, and these vendors help the payers control costs in this capacity. So we hear providers tell us that from time to time, they tell us they have a great relationship with the vendors, but that's exactly what they want you to believe. Remember, these vendors are not your friends. They are compensated on how much money they save their clients, the insurance companies, and they are continually trying to find ways to get more money to the insurance companies and less money to you, the providers. Next slide, please. Pardon me. There are now well over 100 companies assisting payers with out-of-network reimbursements with respect to the bill minimization tactics, and it's costing providers literally billions of dollars per year. Next slide, please. So with that backdrop, let me talk about the micro level first. On a bill-by-bill basis, payers attempt to minimize reimbursements by either negotiating single-case rate agreements at reduced amounts or by repricing bills through a usual and customary reduction. Let me talk about each of them in a little bit more detail on the next slide. Next slide, please. So the vendors who work for the insurance companies, the Viants and Multiplans of the world, receive 10 million plus out-of-network bills each year. These vendors employ senior professionals with deep expertise in understanding how provider organizations operate. So with respect to negotiations, every time a new bill gets received, these vendors that we've been talking about use computer algorithms to determine which of two bill reduction tactics will yield the lowest possible payment to the provider. One tactic is to negotiate a settlement in exchange for the provider agreeing not to balance bill the patient for the discounted amount. So in other words, the insurance company reaches out to negotiate fees after services have been provided, after the patient leaves the facility, but before the insurance company makes a payment. Oftentimes, these are initiated by the vendor faxing a settlement proposal to the provider, often with a very short turnaround time for a response. Where they choose to negotiate, the vendors do so with a vast amount of data at their fingertips. Next slide, please. So let me turn to repricing. The second bill reduction tactic is for the vendor for the insurance company to simply reprice the bill down to reasonable and customary, which is typically close to the Medicare rates. So in other words, the insurance company reprices the out-of-network bill down to 50% or less of bill charges based on their determination of what is reasonable and customary, or doesn't pay at all because the claim's denied or unreasonably delayed. From the insurance company's perspective, when the bill's repriced, they're done. They've satisfied their obligation. There's nothing more to be done. Next slide, please. Next slide. There we go. Okay. So to understand which approach the insurance company will utilize, it's necessary to understand how the decision is made as to whether the bill will be negotiated or repriced. And really the underlying key here is employer preference. So let me explain what that means. So when an insurance company sells to an employer group, the employer group has the ability to dial up or down the out-of-network benefits. If the employer dials up the benefits and pays higher premiums, the claims will be reimbursed better, the employee's happy. If the employer dials down the benefits and pays lower premiums, perhaps choosing a limited benefit policy as an example, the claim will not be reimbursed as well. The employee is not happy because they're left with a larger bill. And the irony of the whole thing is that the insurance company and the vendors have data to support whatever decision the employer group decides to make. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me switch gears here and talk about the complexities of out-of-network bills and how you can combat those complexities. Next slide, please. So while out-of-network represents a great opportunity to increase your reimbursement efforts, dealing with out-of-network can be complicated, and it's necessary you have that requisite expertise to be successful. Take appeals as an example. We talk to providers all the time who talk about how their form of appealing is simply to send a form letter to the insurance company. But as you can see from the following slide, the successful appeals process can be lengthy and very complicated. Next slide, please. So as we talked about before, appeals occur where a payer reprices a bill at a low amount, and you're trying to re-engage that payer to make a second payment. And again, it's about getting the insurance company to change their mind. From their perspective, they're done. They made the right determination of what's reasonable and customary. They've made that payment, and now it's up to you to get them to change their minds, and it can be a labor-intensive process to appeal and obtain a higher payment. Here are the steps that we follow with respect to our appeals process. The first is the initial intake. Ensure that you need to ensure that you have the documentation necessary to handle the claim. You need the bill, you need the EOB, you need the AOB, billing and collections notes. If it's an implant case, you'll want to get the invoice and the logs, for example. And then you move on to step 2, which is payer verification, where you reach out to the payer to verify the patient and bill information and to get a verbal explanation as to the reason for the denials. The next step, the third step, is strategy development. You got to figure out what strategy you're going to use for that claim. What are the facts you're going to present and the arguments you're going to make. Of course, we use Crixus as part of our process to help us hone these arguments. Step 4 is payer engagement, and that's when you reach out to the payer and present the relevant facts and arguments. And to be successful, you need to be able to call every day, write letters every day, escalate when necessary, both internally and externally. And once you present the full information to the payer will then internally reconsider their decision, and weeks can pass before a final decision is made. And that leads us to the last step, which is really following up. Not surprisingly, payers don't always pay on time. They don't always pay in the correct amount. So when you are successful getting an additional payment, you need to follow up with the insurance company to make sure that payment is made. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about explanation of benefits. And by design, EOBs are often difficult to decipher, which when coupled with the fact that staff can be very busy, means that they're not always read correctly. And as an example, I've inserted here a couple of real-life EOBs that show how complex they can be. So the first one says, payments of benefits has been made in accordance with the terms of the managed care system. Now, if you're reading this statement, it might lead you to believe that it was paid with in-network benefits in accordance with the managed care system. But in reality, it's saying that the managed care system allows for out-of-network, and the bill has been processed based on out-of-network benefits. Again, would you be confident that the folks in your business office would understand that case, particularly as busy as they can be? Another example here, claim exceeds fee schedule / maximum allowable or contracted / legislative fee arrangement. this is really a catch-all that gives 4 distinct options as to how this bill was processed, and again, is something that requires follow-up from your team, which again can be time-consuming, particularly in a busy office. Next slide, please. So let me turn to the assignment of benefits, and you must have a well-drafted assignment of benefits to do well with respect to dealing with out-of-network bills. And we're not offering legal advice here, but here are a few of the things that you should keep in mind as you're looking at your AOB. Does it assign the right to appeal and the right to receive relevant documentation? Does it refer to the provider as the patient's authorized representative? Does it properly reference ERISA and a full and fair review of claims? If you don't have a good AOB, it's a roadblock that the payers sometimes put up to stop the appeal process and make it very difficult to get an additional payment. So getting that well-drafted AOB is an important thing to do. Next slide, please. So the next point here is documenting your calls. Are you documenting all your calls with the payers? And while sometimes payers will tell you expressly that you can't depend on what they say during those calls, you're definitely better off ensuring that both parties understood what was said and that the provider has a record of what was said. Along the same lines, you should be asking for reference numbers of all calls. All those calls that you have with the payer with respect to a case do have a reference number. It's not readily given out if you don't ask for it. So it's important that you get these reference numbers, again, in case there's a dispute later as to what happened during the call. Next slide, please. So it's also important to take the right steps prior to treatment. For example, you should definitely check benefits beforehand, and you should seek prior authorization from the insurance company if it's required. It's not perfect. Insurance companies will tell you not to rely on this, on what is said, so to speak. It can provide you with some protection. Next slide, please. Okay. So here's another area of complexity, which is whether to negotiate when those negotiation proposals come from, usually again, via fax from the payer's vendors. We talk to providers all the time that tell us that they throw these negotiation requests in the trash. They do so for a couple reasons. One might be that they don't trust the vendors, or that they think they're doing fine by not negotiating. Well, what really happens? Well, the way this works is the payers give the vendors a certain period of time to make a deal on a particular case. If the vendor is unable to get a deal, the bill is sent back to the payer for repricing, which frequently is done at lower rates. You're better off in most cases. Again, not every case, but most cases, negotiating a settlement. So don't throw those proposals away. Try to make a deal. Doesn't mean you're always going to get a deal, but you're better off, generally speaking, by at least trying to. Now, we also see that people are concerned that about some sort of payer retaliation if you do negotiate aggressively. That really doesn't reflect the situation here. The payers are there and their vendors are there to try to make a deal. Again, from their perspective, they're not always going to make a deal, but they are truly interested in trying to make that type of deal. And in fact, after a successful negotiation, the payers just generate result sheets showing the successful negotiations. It doesn't even refer to the provider by name. Next slide, please. So no matter how you're doing, there's always room for improvement. Here's a short case study from one of our clients using our negotiation prepayment service. Before using us, the client was averaging 74% of bill charges on their settlement negotiations, and like many providers, they thought they were doing fine, and they thought so because 74% is greater than their in-network and Medicare reimbursements. Of course, we would argue that's not the right comparison. When using us, with cases totaling over 1.9 million in billed charges, our average settlement was over 90% of charges, or 1.8 million. So by using our negotiation service and the focus, data, et cetera, that we brought to the table, we were able to increase our out-of-network revenue by more than $140,000. Next slide, please. So another thing that you need to do is audit your results. You need to do periodic review of your out-of-network cases to do two things, really. One is to identify accounts with potentially recoverable underpayments. The other reason is to assess your performance on out-of-network bills. And when we do it for most of our customers, we often are able to find found money, and they're able to ensure that they're operating at the maximum level. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So here's a real-world example that will give you a flavor of the type of revenue that can be generated by appealing and auditing cases properly. This is a surgical hospital who's been a long-standing client of ours, and when we initially suggested an audit, they said no. They'd been sending us cases for some time, and we're sure that they hadn't missed any. And after a while, we were able to convince them to run the report. We uncovered 145 cases that hadn't been sent to us, with $2.9 million in billed charges, initial payments of $691,000. We were able to generate over $500,000 in additional revenue for this customer. Next slide, please. Okay. So let's move from the bill-by-bill minimization strategy used by the payers and discuss the second main strategy used by insurance companies to minimize out-of-network payments, the so-called global discount agreements. This includes third-party rental network agreements and continuous discount agreements. Next slide, please. Okay. So what is a third-party rental network agreement? The third-party rental network agreements are agreements signed not with an individual payer, but with a third party that contracts with a lot of payers. Think of them like a middleman of sorts, bringing together payers and providers to participate in contracts that often are not favorable from a provider perspective for a number of reasons. Moreover, they're often offered to payers and networks that the provider doesn't even know about, the so-called silent PPO. Now, they sound easy. With one contract, you essentially have a contract with a number of different payers that are signed up on the network on the other end. But most providers don't realize that these contracts can be very detrimental from a provider perspective. Next slide, please. So who's the customer here? It's important to understand who is the customer with respect to these agreements. And to be clear, it's not the patient. It's not the provider. It is the insurance company. I urge you to go look at their website. You'll see it right there. And the reason that it's important is that they are not there to serve you, but they're there to serve the insurance companies. And they characterize what they're doing as a cost containment initiative for the payers. So think about it. If they're helping insurance companies save money, who's losing the money? Next slide, please. While these agreements may sound attractive because they are easy to implement, these relationships oftentimes have unintended consequences and really need to be closely scrutinized, whether you're thinking about entering into one of these agreements or you are entered into one of these agreements and you're considering whether you should stay in it. So let me take you through a series of issues that you need to consider as you think about this. And the first one is, how do they treat patient steerage? Be clear that there is typically no patient steerage from these rental network agreements. And this is different than the traditional managed care contract situation. With respect to the traditional managed care contract situation, you can really think about that as being essentially a volume discount. And meaning that you agree to accept lower discounted rates in exchange for the insurance company steering patients to use your services. With respect to the rental network agreements, you have the discount, you're agreeing to the discount, but there is no patient steerage typically. The next point is that providers oftentimes don't even know that they've entered into these agreements. I can't tell you how many times we start working with a new customer and we find out that they're parties to a number of different agreements that they didn't even know they were a party to. And that's because oftentimes these agreements are entered into by staff literally years ago, and no one has kept up with those contracts, and they don't do a careful review of their EOBs, so they don't see the fact that these cases are being processed to this contract. So again, knowing what contracts you're in is very important. The next point, are the payers required to use a contract? No. To begin with, the payers have multiple contracts and will choose the one with the best rate. Also, there may be different types of claims, such as limited benefit policies, that the insurance companies decide that they'd rather process outside the contract than inside the contract because they get a better deal. And in fact, sometimes we talk to providers who are entering into these agreements with the false belief that by entering them, that's going to solve their limited benefit policy issues. But what the payers will do in that situation is just process those cases outside the contract and not use it. Are the reimbursement levels adequate? As we've talked about, out-of-network reimbursements industry-wide are generally higher than contracted reimbursements. So you need to compare that reimbursement level with being out-of-network, not with an in-network agreement. Next slide, please. Okay. So a related question on the reimbursement level part is, sometimes these contracts say that the rate will be a percentage of billed charges. Sometimes it says that it will be a percentage of allowed charges. And we see providers all the time sort of skim over that issue, not reading their contracts carefully, because if it is allowed charges, it has a profound impact on what the reimbursements will be. So what it means is that if it's the allowed situation, it means that payers take a cut and to arrive at the allowed amount, then they apply the percentage to that lowered amount. So an example here, and it's laid out in this chart, but let's say you have a case with $10,000 in billed charges, and the agreement says that they're reimbursing at 70% of allowed charges. The payer then determines that the allowed charges are 60% of charges, or $6,000. Then the discounted rate from the contract, 70%, is applied. So 70% of $6,000 is $4,200. So while some providers don't make that distinction, think they're getting 70% of billed charges, which would be $7,000, they're actually getting 70% of the allowed amount of $6,000, and they get paid $4,200. Obviously a significant difference. Next slide, please. So another key issue with respect to these agreements has to do with the termination provisions. And basically, in these contracts, the way they're structured is they're one-year contracts that automatically renew by what's called an evergreen clause. And a lot of times the termination provision says that you need to give a notice of termination at least 180 days prior to the anniversary date. So let's suppose you've entered into agreement on July 1, 2015, and you decide in April 2016 that you want to cancel it. In other words, 9 months after you entered into the contract. But since you're fewer than 180 days from the anniversary date of July 1, 2016, you wouldn't be able to cancel it until July 1, 2017. In other words, 15 months from the April 2016 date that you decided you wanted to cancel it. Now, there can be, in some of these agreements, shorter termination periods for certain networks as they're specified in the contract. Next slide, please. Okay, some additional points to consider. Are payers applying in-network discounts with out-of-network benefits? Yes, most providers just assume that in-network benefit levels are being applied, but that's not the case. You need to examine whether the agreement provides for multiple procedure reductions or other claim edits. You need to determine whether there's a reference to an administrative handbook. A lot of times the way these contracts are organized is the third-party rental network company has an administrative handbook with respect to the contract, and the contract specifically incorporates that handbook as part of the contract. So you need to make sure that you read that handbook prior to entering into the contract, and when changes are made, you need to keep up to date. So the bottom line is, if you're considering whether to, you may be in a position where you're considering whether to enter into one of these contracts, or you're in a position where you're looking to exit these contracts. These are some of the points you need to keep in mind as you make that determination. Next slide, please. So let me talk about, I'll call it a cousin of the third-party rental network agreement, and that is the continuous discount agreement. This is another tactic used by the vendors for the insurance companies to lock you into reimbursement levels that are quite low. So how do these agreements work? Well, when you're doing a single case rate agreement, which are the single case agreements that you enter into when you're negotiating a settlement of a particular case, a lot of times those agreements, and again, they're one page long, they have a box. And next to that box, it says basically that if you check here, you're agreeing to accept that reimbursement rate going forward. And unwittingly, you may have a staff person who checks that box, not knowing the impact. And again, a lot of times these are folks who haven't been working with you for years at this point, and they're no longer at the facility. And again, because EOBs can be so difficult to decipher, you might not even know that you've entered into a continuous discount agreement. Again, I can't tell you how many times, and it happens all the time, where we'll start working with the customer, dig into their reimbursement levels, and find out that they've entered into all these agreements, including continuous discount agreements, that they didn't know existed. These agreements suffer from many of the same problems that the third-party rental network agreements suffer from. That is, they have no patient steerage, as an example. The good news with respect to these agreements is that they are relatively easy to cancel. Typically, they have a very short termination period, and you can get out of them pretty easily. So that's a big advantage, obviously, as compared to the third-party rental network agreements. Next slide, please. Okay. So let me spend a minute or two talking about outsourcing. And, as we've talked about a couple of different times, remember that the largest payers in the country, and these payers have considerable resources, expertise, and data at their fingertips, they don't do it themselves. They outsource to vendors that specialize in reducing out-of-network payments. Yet despite that fact, I talk to providers all the time who don't even think about outsourcing, even though there's such a great opportunity for them to do much better if they were to do so. And with my legal background, I can't help but think about this in terms of a lay person deciding to act as their own lawyer versus hiring a lawyer. And what I mean by that is, sure, a lay person can represent themselves in court, right? There's nothing prohibiting them from doing so, and they can try a case and do the best they can. On the other hand, if you have a lawyer who's a legal expert, that legal expert's going to understand the facts, they're going to understand the arguments, they're going to understand the judicial system, they're going to understand how to do legal research, and they probably even know the judges themselves and how to argue cases with respect to a particular judge. So, you know, at a minimum, outsourcing requires a deeper look, and a deeper, serious look, we would contend. Next slide, please. Okay. There is one aspect of outsourcing that I wanted to highlight here, and that is the penny wise, pound foolish thing that the provider does with respect to appeal fees. And that is they get a really low quote from a consultant with respect to fees on appeal cases, think that's a great thing, enter into these agreements, and it really just doesn't make sense. Again, if you dig in and look at it from a financial perspective, you know, you want your consultant to be properly incentivized to work a case. So while you might get a low rate from a consultant, the results will actually mirror those low rates, and you won't be able to take advantage of the opportunity. So next slide, please. Let me give you an example of what I mean, and I know there are a lot of numbers here. It'll take me a couple minutes to sort of work through it, but I think you'll see my point when I get to the end here. So let's suppose, and this is a hypothetical, let's suppose that you had 10 underpaid cases. The billed charges were $5,000 per case, so the total billed charges would be $50,000. Okay, so now let's suppose that total initial payments are $2,000 per case, and again, with 10 cases, that would be a total of $20,000. So with a 50% success rate, that would be 5 successful cases. And let's assume that the additional payment per case is $1,000. Next slide, please. So in this case, you'd be receiving $5,000 in additional payments. But let's talk about the consultant's fees. And let's say you got offered a rate of, let's say, 5% of the additional payments that are brought in the door. The total fees on these cases would be $250 or $25 per case. Now, seriously, think about it. How much would a consultant be willing to do for $25? Next slide, please. We talked about the appeals process in detail before, how lengthy it can be, the number of phone calls that need to be made, the number of letters that need to be written. At a rate of $25 per case, I can tell you there's no way a rational consultant would spend significant time doing all these steps in order to get you the results that you saw on the other slide. It just doesn't make economic sense to do so, and it's something you should keep in mind when you are considering the rates you're paying to a consultant, that you need to make sure they're properly incentivized in order for the whole thing to work and for you to take advantage of this opportunity. Next slide, please. Okay. So here's a list of criteria to sort of keep in mind as you're considering whether to use an outsourced vendor. You want to know whether they have the experience, the data, the resources to handle these cases. You know, we've talked about this, but you need to understand how they charge. Is there an upfront charge? Is there a contingency fee? How does implementation work? Do you need to install software? Are there minimums? And then with respect to cancellation, one of the things that we're seeing on the front lines here is these consultants are requiring exclusivity to work cases for a provider. We just think that's a bad idea. If the consultant's good at what they do, they should be confident they'll make their money, and if they're not good at what they do, you shouldn't be locked into using them in the long term. Next slide, please. Okay, so I hope you got a better idea of the things you can do to increase your out-of-network reimbursement. Hope you understood the financial gains from doing so. And as I said at the outset here, the proper out-of-network reimbursement really is a key to increasing overall reimbursements and improving the bottom line. So with that said, let me turn it back over to Meg.
Thank you to Mr. Bartos for a very informative and enjoyable presentation. We will now begin the Q&A portion of the program. As a reminder, you can submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. Our presenter will attempt to answer as many questions as he can during the time we have for Q&A. So the first question, I have a multi-plan contract, but the insurance company I'm out of network with isn't accessing it. Why?
Well, I guess to be clear, insurance companies are not required to access contracts. And there are a number of reasons that they might choose not to do so. Typically, insurance companies, they've entered into a web of contracts, not just one. And when they get claims, they're going to use that contract in that web that gives them the best possible deal. So with respect to the other contracts in that web that they don't use, obviously those aren't being accessed. Also, as I mentioned during the presentation, you have limited benefit policies, and what a lot of times the payers will decide and the vendors will decide is that they're going to do better financially if they handle the limited benefit policy case outside of the contract and inside the contract. In fact, it's one of the things that providers make a mistake of. They think that by having these contracts, their limited benefit claims will be processed pursuant to those contracts and they've solved their problem when in fact they haven't. And then finally, one of the things that the vendors do, and really the payers do, is they will try to beat the contracted rate. So they'll try to negotiate a settlement with the provider that's below the contracted rate, and obviously is a detriment to the provider. So those are some of the reasons that the contract might not be accessed.
Okay, great. Next question. Do the third-party rental contracts apply in situations where there's a fee schedule, such as workers' comp or auto?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes, unless your contract specifically excludes them. Again, the insurance company, they're looking for flexibility to determine whether or not to apply a contract, and they'll make that decision accordingly.
Great. Next question, do I need prior authorization for out-of-network cases?
Not especially for out-of-network cases. Basically the benefit plan provisions with respect to prior auth are going to apply whether or not it's in network. So if you needed prior authorization when you were in network, you're going to need it when you're out of network, and if you don't need it when you're in network, you don't need it if you're out of network. But one of the things you should definitely do in considering a case is call the payer and attempt to seek a prior auth.
Okay. Next question. I have cases where I'm out of network with the same insurance company with the same procedure, and yet I'm reimbursed at very different amounts. How can that be?
Well, ultimately, it's not the insurance company that drives the determination of what is reasonable and customary for a given bill. As we were sort of talking about earlier in the conversation, it's really done at the employer group level. So not only do these groups determine the out-of-network benefit, they also control the methodology used to determine what is reasonable and customary. Now, with that said, occasionally, even with the same group, you might see different payments, and that's where you need to be vigilant with respect to reviewing your EOBs, and when you identify something like that, be right on it. Okay, great. Are you required to refund an out-of-network carrier if they process a claim and then years later come back and say the claim was processed incorrectly? Well, the answer, so we're dealing with refund requests, obviously. The answer is really that it depends. And, first of all, I mean, the question set refers to years later. Different states have different statute of limitations involved, but there's usually a time period within which the payer needs to seek the refund, and if they don't, they lose that right. And that's a state-specific issue that the provider would have to research, but there could be a statute of limitations issue here. Setting that issue aside, whether the payer can do this, it really depends on the particulars of that given case. I mean, handling refund requests is one of the services that we offer, but again, it really is a fact-specific issue.
Okay. It was my understanding that as an out-of-network provider, we can bill the patient the difference between what the insurance pays us and our billed charges. Is that correct?
Well, generally speaking, yeah, the answer is yes. I mean, if you have a bill or a claim that's been repriced and the provider can charge the patient for both the discounted amount and the patient responsibility, meaning copays, deductibles, et cetera. There is an exception to that. If you're entering into a single case rate agreement, those agreements specify that the provider can't charge the patient the discounted amount, although the provider can still go after the patient for copays, deductibles, the patient responsibility piece. Okay, great. And due to time, this will be our final question. How do I increase payments and reduce access to silent PPOs? I wish I had a great answer to that. Frankly, there's not much you can do to control it short of, canceling those agreements. Otherwise, you're really subject to those contracts and how the payers and vendors apply them. Okay, great. I want to again thank our presenter for his excellent presentation and for all of you for participating today. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars. This concludes today's program. Have a wonderful afternoon.